thank you so much for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung for inviting me here. I have since many decades a very great admiration for Rosa Luxemburg. And by the way, Rosa Luxemburg was not only a great socialist thinker, but she has written also extensively on Turkey and on the Middle East, even if the concept was not used by then. So I have been asked to give some comments on the Middle East and Europe, and it appeared to me that it was quite difficult to start such a conference without taking into account the historical dimension. I think that we need history. The political scientists and sociologists need history, but every citizen needs history because history shows us that another world could have been possible, or by the past some other dynamics did exist. And if I take the Middle East of the 19th century and particularly of the 20th century, the history of this part of the world is done by domination, Western domination, colonialism, the mandate regimes, the sharing of the world, the division of the Ottoman Empire in 1919, and the creation of new states such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And actually other Middle Eastern studies, some other Middle Eastern studies, societies or states, they have also been created quite late under European pressure or world pressure, as the Yemenite one and the Libyan one. And that's interesting to see that these newly created states in the 20th century, they are today hosting civil wars. So the relations between the Middle East and European powers, they were unequal relations. They were relations of domination. But still, I think that the two parts of the Mediterranean, the Middle East and Europe, thought that they could have a common future. That was at least the case in the Middle East. And when you take the 1920s, 1930s, you will see that the dominant ideology is either an nationalist ideology or a westernized ideology. And the westernization meant for the Middle East the possibility of taking part of a new history, a world history that will be dominated by the West, but still will bring an emancipation for all the populations. This hope of emancipation through westernization has failed, but then after, when you take the 1950s and 1960s and even 1970s, you will see another ideology becoming dominant, and this ideology is not at all an Islamist ideology. The young generations think that Middle East has been determined by Islamism throughout the 20th century. That was not the case. The Middle East was determined by the left-wing ideas, and one can say that in Europe too, after the Second World War, the left-wing ideas were quite popular, widespread, and at least social democratic governments could be observed in some parts of Europe, as Austria, Germany, and Sweden. And what the Middle East, the left-wing Middle East, thought in the 1950s or 1960s, I think that once again this part of the world, the Middle East, wanted through the idea of revolution and progress create a universal unity with the West. And the idea was to break down through violence in some cases, as the anti-colonial wars, to break down the dialectic of master and slave, liberate the master from its needs to have slaves, and to create a common future. And this left-wing movements of the Arab world, namely in the Arab world, but one could observe them also in Turkey or in Iran, were also a part of the three-continental contest. The three-continental contest was the contest that was supposed to unify Africa, Latin America, and Asian countries. And these ideas actually were quite popular also in Europe. In Europe of 1970s, no one could condemn the idea, the very idea of revolution. Just give you To give you one example, in 1970s, André Glucksmann, who died and who passed away a couple of months ago, and at the end of his life, he has become a very conservative thinker. André Glucksmann could say that the revolutionary violence was not only a historical necessity, but also a moral obligation. Jean-Paul Sartre actually wrote exactly the same thing. The fact that revolution was the future of the humanity and that violence could be a part of that was nothing that could shock the Western, let's say, public opinions in the 1960s and 1970s. I think that the breaking point took place between Europe and the Middle East sometime between 1978 and 1979. In Europe, during this period, we have the action of Rote Armee Fraktion in Germany. The revolutionary violence became something unsupportable, unacceptable in the German democratic society. And more importantly, we have the assassination of Aldo Moro in Italy. Aldo Moro, the former Prime Minister of Italy, and the killing of Aldo Moro leads to the creation of a historical bloc against the idea of violence, and the Communist Party takes part of this historical bloc. After 1978-1979, one can see that a new interpretation of the left-wing movements can take place, the so-called Eurocommunism. And actually one of the Greek thinkers, Nikos Poulantzas, is one of the leading thinker of this new left-wing movements. And gradually, these left-wing movements will become a green movement, and we can say that at the beginning of the environment movements throughout Europe, they are basically the former left-wing militants. So the revolution transformed itself into the expectation of an evolution and of change through democratic participation to the society. Meanwhile, in the 1978 and 1979, in the Middle East, we have an entirely different situation. The Palestinian issue is still there. The revolutionary regimes in Iraq, in Syria, and in Egypt, and that took place in the 1950s and 1960s have been corrupted into the authoritarian regimes. And in 1979, Egypt, which was until then the main power of resistance against the so-called American imperialism and Zionism, recognized Israel, and during the same period, Afghanistan is occupied by Soviet Union, and most importantly, a revolution takes place in Iran. This revolution at the beginning is a left-wing revolution, but after the participation of the Bazaris, the people of Bazar, and the clergy, this revolution becomes a green one, and Islamism as an ideology and as a mode of militance, mobilization, replaces the left-wing ideas. There is still a kind of revolutionary urgency in the Middle East, while at the same moment in Europe, the idea of revolutionary urgency loses any kind of credibility. And Afghanistan, the occupation of Afghanistan leads to a war which is jihadized very quickly, and actually the Americans, they participate to the jihadization of the Afghan resistance. There is a war between Iran and Iraq, which is one of the most bloodiest war in the second part of the 20th century. You have the intensification of the Lebanese civil war, and these wars create a new political grammar in which you don't speak anymore about the anti-imperialist struggle, but you speak about the Darul Islam, the house of Islam, as opposed to Darul Kuffar or Darul Harb, the house of the Kuffar, the unbelievers, or the house of war. You don't speak anymore about the women emancipation. You don't speak anymore about socialism or progress, but you speak about the jihad as the sixth pillar of Islam. And this new period in the Middle East is marked by a wide-scale transhumance of military transhumance. The jihadization of the Afghan war leads to the military mobilization of thousands or tens of thousands of the Arabs from anywhere from the Arab world, Morocco, Tunisia, but also Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. While you have a pacified Europe, the Middle East becomes or hosts a quite intensive military transhumance. And most importantly, in the 1960s or 1970s, the Middle Eastern contestants, they imagined the world as an unified universal arena of struggle. After 1979, universal for the Islamist militants means only the Islamic world. The universal is ended up. I will not insist here longly on the period between 1979 and 2011, the year of the Arab revolutionary contest, but I will insist on the three aspects, and thereafter I will come back to the European continent. The first aspect is linked to the authoritarian regimes. After 1979, we have the consolidation of the authoritarian regimes that appears to be eternal. These authoritarian regimes do not seek to have the participation of their society. They became gradually external bodies to their society. They abandon any kind of idea of welfare state. They are organized as a state cartel, and the security apparatus plays a decisive role in the functioning of this authoritarian state. They don't have any ideology, neither, or their ideology is a conservative ideology based mainly on the securitarian issues. And most importantly, these authoritarian regimes are kleptomanic regimes, and one can say that after the 1979-1980, you see the formation of a comprador bourgeoisie throughout the Middle East, which is a part of the state, but which is dominated. And these authoritarian regimes, as I said, until 2010-2011, appears to be something eternal that you cannot change. The second aspect that I can underline is that gradually, namely in the 1990s and 2000s, you observe a massive social fatigue in the Middle East. The Middle East has been mobilized, namely the Arab world, in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s for the Arab nationalist ideology. Thereafter, there has been a mobilization, left-wing mobilizations, which was massive in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and thereafter you have yet another mobilization, an Islamist one, throughout the 1980s. And when you come to the 1990s, you have the impression that all these mobilizations have failed and that there are no more any kind of horizon that you have to search. During this period, of course, some other countries of the world, they also experience quite massive crisis. Take the case of China, takes the case of Russia too, or Latin America. But in Latin America, after 1980s, you have a transition to democracy, or at least the collapse of the former oligarchic regimes. In China, you have the cult of power. China wants to become the second power of the world and convince its population, in spite of Tiananmen, to share the ambitions of the state. Russia, after its crisis, tries to re-become a world power, while in the Muslim world, everything failed and nothing is at the horizon. And that creates also a kind of malaise in the societies. You have massively demobilized societies. And the third aspect is linked to the issue of violence. Of course, in the 1950s and 1960s too, there was a violence, but there was a revolutionary left-wing violence that was a kind of optimistic violence aiming at the establishment. You can consider it as an utopia or not, at the establishment of independent Arab world and at the establishment of a socialist Middle East. In the 1980s and 1990s, the violence that we have is not an optimistic violence. It does not have as leaders young bodies like Nasser or Arafat or Leila Khaled. We have new violence that has as incarnating bodies Khomeini, 80 years old, Sheikh Yassin, who was an old man, Palestinian leader. We have Sayyid Qutb, executed at the age of 66 in 1966 by Nasser. So the old bodies that have testified, that have hosted authenticity, values and resistance became the dominant figures. And these dominant figures asked their youth, their young people, to sacrifice themselves for the authenticity and the cause. And violence take place. This violence create a lot of problems, as one can observe in Algeria in the 1990s. Also, the main reason is not violence, but that was also the decline or the collapse of a corrupted regime. And this violence is dominating the margins of the Muslim societies. And 9/11 is clearly testifying clearly the impact of these margins this violence at the margins of the societies. And from the margins, this violence tries to return back to the center and to change the societies as such. And I will come back to this issue. I think that these three aspects, authoritarianism, violence and social fatigue, were also the main causes of the Arab revolutionary contest in 2011. While at the same time in Europe, you have an entirely different picture. 1979, as I said, is very important for the Middle East, but it is also very important for Europe, because in 1979, Margaret Thatcher is elected as the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And the basic ideas of Margaret Thatcher, you know that the society does not exist. Margaret Thatcher declares the first war against the social welfare state, against the welfare state. In accordance to Margaret Thatcher, if there is poverty that does not require a social distribution, a just distribution of the incomes, but on the contrary, simply the charity, the poor have to be dealt with through charity and nothing else. And the idea of social solidarity, the idea of a society does exist only if it is a society of solidarity, is not accepted by the neoliberalism. And the neoliberalism became the dominant ideology gradually in the Western countries, because immediately after Margaret Thatcher, you have another election, which is the election of Ronald Reagan. And you can say that in spite of the election of François Mitterrand in France, or returning back a couple of years later of the Social Democrats in Germany, the neoliberalism became the dominant ideology after 1979 and 1980. And even the left-wing, the former left-wing parties like Social Democrats under the leadership of Gerhard Schröder, and the Labour under the leadership of Tony Blair, they actually do not put into question the neoliberalism. On the contrary, they radicalize to some extent the neoliberalism. After 1979, but actually it did started already in 1973, the crisis became the main vocabulary or vocable of the European societies. And the crisis became almost a system, a political economic system. You cannot imagine the system without mentioning the crisis, and the crises are economic ones mainly, but their price is very high because Europe enters into a permanent period of unemployment. After 1980s, one can say that the two categories do play a very important role in the European societies. The first one is the category of the middle classes. All the European societies became the middle class societies, and Greece is not an exception. And what does it mean, the middle class societies? The middle class societies, they are very keen about their values, their individual rights, and I will come back to this issue. It is nothing hateful about that. They probably want also much more open societies. They are keen to show some signs of solidarity, but at the same time, they are the societies that are scared of future, and they are scared of losing what they have. The status quo has always been determining for the middle classes, and I think that after 1979-80, if the societies hold together, the quest for the status quo can explain it largely. And the second category is the category of unemployed people. It is fascinating to see that the industrial world disappears after 1979-1980s in Europe. Once again, Great Britain was the model. The mines have been crushed down in an extreme brutality, but under François Mitterrand in France, the same thing happened. And in the 1990s, the industry has been truly outsourced to other countries, namely to China. And the new category that has been created through this outsourcing is the category of unemployed people. And it is well known, the unemployed people are also unable to mobilize. The working class can mobilize. The working class has factories, has concrete physical spaces. While you are unemployed, you enter into a process of desocialization. You can mobilize during 5 months, 6 months. After 6 months, you are alone, and you can gather occasionally, but you are not in a permanent logic or dynamic of mobilization. For those who have read Marx, Marx used to say that the Indian peasantry has become something totally superfluous, totally unneeded, and there was not even a meaning in exploiting the Indian peasantry. And I think that our societies in Europe have created this category of unemployed people that are not even needed to be exploited. And that means that Europe already by then has had no ambition to preserve the welfare state. Of course, the picture is not entirely dark. I think that the feminist movement has progressed a lot during the 1990s and 2000s. The case of the migrants have become an important part of the society. In many countries, in Germany, in Sweden, many people have been elected to the assemblies, national assemblies. They were from a migrant background. The case of the LGBT, I think that 40 years ago, in a country of such as France, being homosexual was almost a crime, while today the homophobia is considered as a crime. So I think that many things changed, many positive things also took place, but the European societies during this time have lost their capacity of defining politics, to criticize the society on the basis of a radical, on the basis of a demand of a radical thinking. That's why it is extremely important to see what people like Bruno Kreisky or Willy Brandt or Olof Palme have been able to suggest in 1960s and 1970s. And I would say that even the Linke or Syriza in Greece are not able to formulate such radical demands, while they were not communist but simply social democrats. And I would add, I will come back to this issue too, I would add that the security has become a main issue even during these years. If I return back to the Arab world or to the Middle East, broadly speaking, after 1979, another breaking point took place in this part of the world, namely in the Arab world, but with some impact elsewhere. And this breaking point was 2011. 2011 was the years of uprisings that have started in Tunisia and spread themselves to Egypt, and very soon some other countries like Bahrain, Libya, Syria and Yemen became arenas of a massive revolutionary contest. This revolutionary contest wanted to get rid of the authoritarianism, wanted elections, wanted what the French philosopher Claude Lefort called the democratic uncertainty. Democratic uncertainty means that you enter into elections, but you don't know who wins the elections, but you are sure that the loser of the elections will not lose his head. In order to have a democratic uncertainty, you need a state of law. Only the certainty of the state of law can warrant the existence of a democratic uncertainty. These societies wanted also to get rid of the social fatigue. They wanted to be redynamized, re-energized through revolutionary contest. And they wanted to get rid of violence, because when you take at least the Egyptian and the Tunisian cases, these cases were not violent cases, but rather pacific ones. And even in Libya, until the end of June 2011 in Syria and in Yemen, the revolutions were at the beginning pacific. They became violent after massive state repression. And they wanted to get rid of violence that the Arab and Muslim world produced and that ended up by threatening itself. And if I had to define the 2011 uprisings, I will say that they were the uprisings aiming at the integration to the bourgeois democratic city, bourgeois democratic society. They were not eschatological revolutions. They didn't want to invent a new regime, a new time, a new humankind. They didn't aim at the regeneration of the humanity, as that was the case of the French Revolution, at least the second half of the French Revolution, the post-October Soviet Revolution, or the Iranian Revolution. And they wanted to articulate for the first time in the Arab history revolution and democracy. Before 2011, in the Arab world, the democrats scared revolution, because the past revolutions have been nationalist ones, although some of them they presented themselves as socialist revolutions or Islamist ones. On the other side, the revolutionaries, they hated democracy, because for them democracy was a way of dividing the society. In 2011, democracy and revolution could get together, go together, as only democracy could allow the revolution to take place, and only revolution could allow to democracy to become a system. But But for the reasons I will not be able to analyze here, the outcome of 2011 contest has not been the liberation of the societies, maybe except in the Tunisian case, but either a bloody dictatorship, as that's the case in Egypt, where the Islamists have been massacred, but today the left-wing movements, they are crushed down, or a massive collapse of the societies in Libya, in Yemen, and mostly in Syria. This collapse is not only the collapse of the states, that's not only the collapse of existing state powers or the power relations, but a collapse of the societies themselves. I think that in some parts of the Middle East, we are attesting for the first time after 1915, the genocide of the Armenians, to such a dramatic event which consists that the societies are henceforth destroyed. And through this destruction, we have the collapse of the 20th century as such. The ending Ottoman Empire, which ended actually in violence and repression, the dividing of the Ottoman lands between Britain and France, the colonial order, or the socialist regimes, or the pro-Western regimes, and Islamism itself, they are collapsing altogether, leaving the 21st century almost orphan of anything. Together with the breaking up of these societies, one also needs to reread what happened in the 20th century. The collapse of the 20th century means that we have to have a critical look at the 20th century. A critical look at the 20th century, it means that we have to confess at the end that the interwar Arab nationalism was anti-imperialist, but was not progressist, was influenced, heavily influenced, but by right-wing movements in Europe. Criticizing the 20th century means that we have to criticize also the left-wing movements of 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Some of them, they were progressive. Some of them, they were universalist. But at the same time, they did not accept democracy. Or if they accepted democracy, this democracy was an East Bloc model of democracy. It means a democracy that did not accept internal conflicts. Or you cannot imagine democracy if you aim at the building of an organic society, a society where there is no difference between society and the state. The state dominates the society, and the society is not divided. The division, the internal conflicts are at the basis of democracy. But these socialist movements never have accepted the internal conflictuality. And criticizing the 20th century means also that we have to criticize the Islamist movement as such. Many colleagues have said that what happened in the Middle East in the 20th century, in the 1980s and 1990s, and even today, was simply an revenge of the southern societies against the Western. But at the same time, when you developed a critical look at what happened through the spread of Islamism, you will see that Islamism was a repressive movement vis-à-vis the body, a repressive movement vis-à-vis as far as the women issue is concerned, a repressive movement as far as the equality, men and women equality is concerned, as far as equality of the Muslims and non-Muslims are concerned, and Islamism has almost made impossible to have a critical reading of the religious fact in a society. And the crisis of today is, to some extent, as Simone Weil and Walter Benjamin saw it in Europe of 1930s and 40s, a cumulative crisis of the past decades. That's not only the crisis of the 2010s, but a cumulative crisis of the past. The past with all these waves of repression and violence is in a crisis. And this crisis today create massive conditions of disintegration and fragmentation. Just to give you one idea, or two figures maybe, or three, when you take the Libyan society today, there are 300 militia forces in Syria. In 2013, there was 1,200 militia forces in Syria. It means that the collective time and the collective space were divided into 1,200. And if the Islamic State has succeeded so easily, one of the reasons was that no society was able to bear such a massive fragmentation. And a last figure, out of 22 million of Syrians, 300,000 have been killed, and more than 11 or maybe 12 million have been either internally displaced or exiled. If you take these figures and you try to translate them into a country such as France, that will give 900,000 deaths and 34 million people displaced or refugees, and total or partial destructions of cities like Marseille, Lyon, Lille, Rennes, etc. So the disintegration is there, and disintegration has went also hand in hand in some countries like in Yemen and particularly in Syria with sectarianism, the sectarian hold up on the society, or the tribal domination, as that's the case in Yemen and in Libya. We will probably come back to this issue during the discussions. Now I once again will come back to Europe. What happened in Europe of 2010s while the Middle East was in revolutionary contest and in disintegration? Of course, in Europe, we have much more institutionalized societies than in the Middle East. In the Middle East, the state is very weakly institutionalized, and the society is informally institutionalized. And the fact that European societies are institutionalized means that the middle classes have some capacities of durability and resistance, and the individual rights are protected. We have still in the European societies, including Greece, a Westphalian type of societies, and the Hobbesian Leviathan is there. Leviathan has not been transformed into a behemoth, as that's the case in Libya or in Syria. The societies are still participating to the making of politics to some extent, very little but still, and we cannot say that the state and societies are entirely separated. Still, it is important to see that the motto of the Respublica, not only of the French Republic, but the Respublica, liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and fraternity, remains an illusion. Liberty is warranted, and I think that we can say that the European citizens are free, but are they equal, and are they fraternal? I think that in 2010s, we saw that this equality and this fraternity did not exist. And worse than that, that was not on the agenda of the European political class, widely speaking. Today, mentioning fraternity and equality will make you someone quite utopian. Only an utopian citizen can still ask for equality and fraternity, while everyone knows that we are living under a heavy economic crisis. And under these circumstances, I think that the European social model has been redefined not in relation with the social welfare, with the welfare state, but with the quest of our style of life. And this is, once again, I think that's very important. The question of who we are, that's very important. But can a society live only through its style of life without having internal solidarity? At the same time, one can observe that the political domain has failed. Has failed because it was incapable of producing a political sense. It was incapable of producing the political conflicts. In a country such as France today, you can hardly say that there is a political conflict. You have Front National, from right wing, radical right wing, but otherwise, why should you vote for the left wing or right wing? You have no answer to that. Why the left wing proposes something that the right wing does not propose, or vice versa, you have basically no answer. And the citizens are not taking, the citizens take part in the everyday life. When you have the Bataclan case in Paris, of course the citizens are there and the citizens defend their society. But the citizens do not vote because they simply don't know why should they vote and for what should they vote, because there is no more political conflict. And as you know, many sociologists in the beginning of the 20th century, and actually many philosophers also, they define the society, democratic society, as a society of conflict. Here you have a society without conflict, not because the society wants it, but as there was no more any horizon, and the neoliberalism or the given order was the only social horizon that we could have. And you see that in the economic case too. I follow the Greek crisis since 2008 and some other crises too. But Europe acts, not only Europe, many citizens in Europe too, the Greek citizens too, as they could have no say in the economic field. As the economic field was an entirely suprahuman field, a field determined by uncontrollable, unhuman mechanisms and power relations, and as that was a total autonomy of the economic field, and the citizen intervention in the economic field had no meaning at all. And consequently, that collectively a society cannot be a sovereign society and say that I want to change the economic fate of my country. And the Greek example, of course, has shown that, but I am not sure that tomorrow the other European societies will not experience the same fate. I am not sure that the Greek case is not only a case of a pattern, does not only offer a pattern that tomorrow can be also reproduced elsewhere, including in most developed European societies such as France or Britain or Germany. And these massive social and economic problems do not find any platform where they could be discussed. It is very interesting to see that today the European street is becoming a place of discussion. Everywhere in the European cafes, people discuss, but the political space, the assemblies, are not the places where these discussions can take place or have an impact. I will certainly not say that we have a process of disintegration in Europe, or that today's Europe share some common points with Syria. Thanks God, the situation is not similar, but still we see also that European societies produce a kind of violence, and this violence interact today with the violences that the Middle East produce. When you take the violence produced in the Middle East in the 1990s and in 2000s, this violence took place in the margins of the societies. Al-Qaeda, for instance, as an organization, has recruited and radicalized itself in the camps, military camps in Sudan and Afghanistan, in the Arab jails, and the torture was applied systematically in the Arab jails, and in the European universities as in Frankfurt. They were a few thousands of men, not more. Today, probably we have some 150 or 200,000 jihadists around the world. And the violence that European societies produce in their margins, in some banlieue, the suburbs, or in some European cities, small cities, they do aggregate with the violence produced in the Middle East. And violence in the Middle East today is enlarged to the European societies. And what is very interesting to see is that this violence create a kind of utopia, create a kind of re-enchantment. There are many Muslim young people participating to this new radicalism coming from the Middle East, but there are also some Christian-born people, such as Jean-Daniel Bons and Nicolas Bons, two brothers, 19 and 21 years old, both killed in Syria. This violence, of course, does attack to the European style of life, does attack the civilization, not the European civilization, but the civilization as a generic category, because I think that there is only one single civilization across the world, propose an utopia of ab nihilo, aim at the restoration of a new entity called as a Khalifa, and invites the young generations to take place in something unprecedented, a kind of Third Reich, or a kind of renewal of Islamic Dar al-Saada, la maison du bonheur, the house of happiness. This violence is both rational, because it is able to create state structures, which is something quite impressive in the condition of the 21st century, and at the same time, simultaneously, this violence has suicidal dynamics. And no one can deny that the situation is extremely serious in the Middle East, and the million of refugees that we have show that, but no one can deny not either that the situation is also serious in Europe. And the French example in January and in November, as well as the Danish example of February, showed it as. And it is obvious that this violence can weaken the democracies in the European societies. And I think that as any society, the democratic society has also right or even the obligation to defend itself. And defense of democracy may well require even the use of arms. On the other hand, however, how to manage this enlargement of the Middle East, how to manage the risk of the Islamophobia, how to deal with the question of equality, and how to make that we do not ethnicize migrant group within Europe, we do not discriminate them, and we do not switch from the social struggles to the ethnical, racial, and religious struggles, as many populist or radical right-wing movements demanded in Europe and as they demanded actually also by the past in the 1920s and 1930s. On one side, we have to understand that Islamophobia does exist, as the radical Islamist threat does exist. We have, on the other side, also accept that Islam is a part, henceforth, of European history and society. Having said that, how to deal with Islam? Could we say that we will be able to criticize Christianity, any religion, and not criticize Islam as such? How can we say that the Enlightenment, the ideology of, or the doctrine of Enlightenment, that was not an ideology, the philosophy of Enlightenment is not universal, and that we have to be multicultural? Of course we have to be multicultural. But we have to accept any culture, or what we define as a culture, even if it is repressive. What the Enlightenment meant? Enlightenment meant three things, and I think three universal things. The first one, the capacity of criticizing the state, the power, and the power relations, wherever they might be. Second, the capacity of criticizing the society and social relations. The Enlightenment has never sacralized the society. On the contrary, the society has to be criticized, has to be transformed through citizen actions. And the Enlightenment meant, thirdly, the capacity of criticizing the religion, the capacity of criticizing the theocracy, the obedience, the articulation of the religion with repressive practices. That's why Kant have mentioned the existence of two distinct faculties, the faculty of rationality and the faculty of theocracy, and underlined the necessity of keeping this struggle between these two faculties. How can we do today in order so to do that the struggle between these two faculties are always kept open? So I think that all that kind of questions are the questions that we have today in Europe. And please allow me to insist on one last point. It will take 3-4 more minutes, I am sorry, which is linked to what happens in the Middle East of today, 2015, 2016, with the presence of the Russian intervention, with the presence of Russian army in Syria. I think that has changed the power equilibrium, both in the Middle East, at least in this Near East, and in Europe. If Russia has intervened in the Middle East, one of the reasons was that actually Europe, but also the Americans, were tired of the Middle East. And I think that we can say that they were also tired of Islam and of the Muslim world too. And one can understand this fatigue. This fatigue is not only synonymous of Islamophobia, that's also a fatigue of not understanding what happened there, but who understands? How can we explain that there are thousands of suicide attacks in the Middle East or in the Muslim world? How can we explain that Muslim world repeats exactly what happened in Europe between 1618 and 1648 during what some historians call the European Civil War? And Russia is not tired of the Middle East. I think that here we have something quite unexpected. Russia is not tired of the Middle East because it is the only power that can still mobilize the geopolitical categories, hateful geopolitical categories of the 19th century, it wants to become a Mediterranean power, and through this Mediterraneanization of its empire, it wants to take the advantage of the Cold War. This policy is more and more articulated with the Middle Eastern dynamics, with the Cold War going between Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. And this Cold War can produce very dangerous consequences affecting directly the European continent. Europe didn't want to be in the Middle East, and today Europe faces the consequences of its not willingness to deal with the Middle East or to be in the Middle East. And the refugee crisis is probably only the beginning of a huge, a very long process. The question is how Europe can be involved in the Middle East. Certainly not as a superpower, because it is not a superpower, and it should not be a superpower, but maybe as a constructive power. But how this Europe, where the citizenship does not play any role, where there is no more citizen mobility, where there is no more citizen participation, can play such a positive role. How can Europe, which has no debate on its security, can play a constructive role? Just to give you a last example, in France, the society is obsessed by its security, and that's quite normal. But at the same time, there is no debate on the French foreign policy or on the military issues. France has 5,000 soldiers on the ground, and the total effectives of the French army is 114,000. So it makes 1/21 of the army is on the ground. But there is absolutely no debate, not because the power holders want to forbid the debate, but not even a public demand, a citizen demand on what's France, on the discussion, what is France doing there and what should it do. And I think that that's also the case almost of all the European societies. So a constructive role, Europe has to play a constructive role in the Middle East, but how? Here I think that we are reaching a dead end. So I will stop here.